Hey folks, Matt Easton here, scholagladiatoria. So one of the questions that comes up fairly often under my videos is there a point to training with heavier weapons? And a lot of people know Vegetius from the 4th century describes Roman soldiers training with heavier weapons and shields. Now, first thing we have to say is Vegetius is a very particular source. It's late in the Roman period, and he's supposedly talking about things which were maybe done earlier, or harking back to the way that things should be done. And we don't actually really know how widespread the training with heavier weapons was in the Roman period. But nevertheless, he is only one source, and there are many different views on this topic. Now, the thing which has inspired me to make this brief video on this topic is firstly the fact that I get asked about it a lot, but also secondly because Bill Grandy, a well-known HEMA instructor, fencing instructor, I'll post the link below, has written a very interesting short article on this topic. And we will cover some of the same ground, but I recommend you to read his article because it's not long and it's very concise and really covers the topic very well. Now, a lot of people assume that if you train with a heavier sword, for example, this could apply to any weapon, but let's talk about swords because that's mostly what I talk about on my channel. But most people assume that if you train with a heavier sword, when you come to train with a lighter weapon, it will make you more nimble, quicker, stronger, more explosive. Does it? Well, a lot of people assume that to be the case, but modern science and sporting practice is perhaps starting to indicate the fact that this may actually be a sort of placebo effect, and it may be that it feels like we are quicker, faster with that lighter weapon because it's a comparative thing, and that in actual fact it's not necessarily making us quicker or more nimble with that weapon. Now, what's interesting is a lot of people say, oh, well, historically people trained with heavier weapons, so therefore we should. Well, that's not necessarily true. As Bill points out in his article, in actual fact some sources refer to training with lighter weapons, because with lighter weapons you can spar for longer, fence for longer, train for longer, and carry out repetitive movements over and over and over again. And as an example, he makes the comparison between, this is actually a British gymnasium sabre, but quite a light one, and it's modelled on earlier Italian types. But he makes the comparison between the training Italian, what is sometimes known as a dueling sabre, but really is just a practice weapon for the military sabre, at least in its blunt form, with its very narrow blade, compared to the more typical and slightly earlier period British military gymnasium sabre, which has a broader blade. In fact, the weights aren't very different between these two weapons, but the point of balance on this example, on the narrow bladed one, is much closer to the hand. The point of balance on the 1864 gymnasium sabre is further out. It's closer to where a real sword would be. And Alfred Hutton, for example, believed that this is the weapon that people should train with because it was the same weight, balance and size as the real sword that they would use in service. I have to say, I tend to, in general, agree with Hutton in that I find that if you want to use a specific weapon, you should train with a training tool, a simulator, that is as close to that as possible. So in this case, if I want to use a real infantry officer's sword or sabre, then training with the gymnasium sabre of the same size and weight, for me, works best. However, recently I have actually been training with some prototype gymnasium sabres because, as regular viewers of my channel will know, I'm actually working on a new gymnasium sabre that people can buy and train with today, and one of the prototypes I have is notably heavier. It's about 300 grams heavier than the other one. Now, I find it a strain to fight for any amount of time with the heavier sword. The heavier sword is about 1200 to 1300 grams, and the lighter one's about 900 grams. I'm used to fencing with a 900 gram sabre. I am not used to fencing with a 1300 gram sabre or a 1200 gram sabre. To put those into comparative terms as far as the real swords are concerned, that's the sort of difference between an infantry officer's sabre and a cavalry sabre. In fact, many cavalry sabres are lighter than that, so it's the comparison between a medium weight sabre and a really quite heavy top end of the heavyweight sabre. And I found, or I thought I found, that after fencing for a while with the heavy weapon and then switching to the lighter weapon, I felt faster with the lighter weapon. But when I think about it more deeply, I think it probably is a placebo effect. I think it's probably just imagined. I don't think that I actually become quicker with the lighter weapon. And as Bill asserts in his article, I think that probably if I wanted to make myself quicker with the lighter weapon, what I should focus on is overall strength and stamina, not necessarily just using a heavier weapon. So doing push-ups, running, doing weights to some extent, and squats for the legs. Remember, it's not just about the arms. So I think that Bill's article is definitely onto a good point. I'm going to think more about it. And apparently in baseball, not a sport I know anything about, but I do know that historically baseball players often used to hold two bats and swing those so that they felt quicker and more powerful with one bat. But apparently in more recent times they're now stopping doing that because they think that there's no real benefit to it. So it could be just because Vegetius in the 4th century says that the Roman soldiers did a certain thing. For a start, we don't know how many of them actually did that, but it could be that they were doing it for no great benefit. People historically sometimes did things because they thought they were beneficial, and they weren't. Historical people weren't always correct. They didn't have access to the same data, statistics and scientific understanding as we do today. One other thing I want to say as well, which adds on to Bill's article, is that he used the example of the Italian sabre masters who made the point that the light sabre was advantageous to train with over the heavier gymnasium sabre because you could train for longer with it. And he asserts that Hutton says the opposite and says it's better to use a weapon of real fighting weapon weight. That's correct. However, I would add to that in British Victorian fencing sources, there is almost the opposite thing said as well. For example, in studying the sources surrounding John Musgrave Waite's work, they point out that whilst Waite taught the use of the foil, or small sword as well as the sabre, and they say that he was a very competent foil fencer. They say that he was not as good with the small sword as he was with the sabre, because he used the single stick and the sabre so much that it lost his sensitivity at using the small sword. And that's a very interesting point. And I've seen a number of British Victorian sources state this, that to have a truly subtle and almost soft use of the sword that is required to be a really excellent or outstanding foilist or small sworder, often if you're used to using heavier swords, it ruins your subtlety and your sensitivity of grip, which is a very interesting point. Countering that yet again, we know that in the Victorian period they often trained with these lead cutters, which are essentially giant overweight cutlasses that are used for cutting through bars of lead. So the Victorians themselves were contradictory. On one hand, you've got some of them saying that you should use a weapon of equal weight to the one you intend to fight with. Then you've got Italian Victorians essentially saying you should use a lighter sabre because you can train for longer with it. And then you've got British Victorian fencers saying that using the sabre ruins the subtlety of your foil play or small sword play. But then you've equally got other Victorian British swordsmen and fencers telling you to train with heavy weapons to build up your arm strength. So I think Bill touches on this in his article again, and I completely agree with it. Historically, if we're only going to go by historical examples and what historical sources say, they all say different things. There are historical sources that tell you to use a weapon of equal weight and concentrate on that. There are historical sources that tell you to use weapons of lighter weight so you can train for longer. and learn more subtlety, and there are historical sources which tell you to use heavier weapons to build up your strength. So to summarise, I would say experiment with all of the above and find what works for you. And I would also reiterate Bill's caution that training with heavier weapons can increase the chances of injury, not just injury to yourself because you're using a heavier weapon. And some of you have seen me wielding that 8-pound two-handed sword one-handed. Don't do that. Don't do that at home. My wrists are fairly used to swinging swords around, but seriously, swinging an 8-pound sword around one-handed is a little bit foolhardy, and if you do it often, you're probably going to screw up your wrists or elbows or shoulders, or your fence. But you know, you can find all views historically, but as well as the danger to yourself of training with heavier weapons, if you're sparring with heavier weapons, then obviously it's a bigger danger to your training partner. And I think that's another point of using weapons for fencing that are perhaps on the light side of historical, or lighter than historical, exactly as we see in modern sport fencing, because it's safer. It is far safer to hit someone with a light sword than a heavy sword, for obvious reasons. Sir Isaac Newton, see above. So there we go, folks. Historically, you can find the use of heavier weapons, lighter weapons, and weapons the same weight as the real fighting weapons. And there are perhaps advantages to each of those, but it's certainly not a case that training with heavier weapons is universally advantageous, and science is making us question whether it's advantageous at all. Cheers, folks.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.